Greetings, brave souls. Tonight, the Nightmare Maestro brings you a tale that will make you think twice about ever accepting a ride from a stranger. You see, every year dozens of hikers vanish along the Appalachian Trail. Most blame the wilderness, the terrain, the weather, the wildlife. But I know the truth. I've seen the real predator who hunts those remote trails, and unlike the others, I lived to tell about it. Though sometimes I wonder if survival was truly a mercy. The autumn sun was already sinking behind the mountains when James Reynolds stuck out his thumb on that desolate stretch of road intersecting the Appalachian Trail. The crisp October air carried the musty scent of decaying leaves and the sharp tang of approaching winter. He'd been walking for hours after his hiking partner, Mike, sprained an ankle badly enough to require evacuation. Rather than abandon their planned through hike entirely, James had decided to skip ahead to their next scheduled stop and wait there. The temperature was dropping fast, painting the sky in deep purples and blues that made the surrounding forest look like bruised flesh. The nearest town was still 15 miles away when a mud-spattered Ford F-150 finally slowed to a stop, its headlights cutting through the growing gloom like searching eyes. The truck's engine had a deep, throaty rumble that seemed to resonate with something primitive in James's hind brain, triggering an instinct to run that he forcefully ignored. The driver introduced himself as Larry Jones, a local hunter tracking what he called rare game in the area. He wore well-worn camouflage that had seen better days, with dark stains that James tried not to look at too closely. Larry spoke with an easy familiarity about the mountains that made James relax despite his initial wariness, sharing stories about the area's history and pointing out landmarks barely visible in the fading light. His knowledge seemed encyclopedic, though something about the way he described the various hikers who'd passed through felt oddly personal. Larry mentioned his cabin was just a few miles ahead and offered James a hot meal and shelter for the night. The warmth of the truck's heater and his aching feet made the decision seem simple enough, though James couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the situation. As they drove deeper into the darkness, he noticed the odd modifications to the truck. A reinforced bumper with suspicious dents, extra lighting arrays that seemed positioned to illuminate the woods rather than the road, and what looked like heavy-duty restraints bolted into the truck bed. Larry caught him looking and explained they were necessary for transporting his trophies, though something about the way he said it made James's skin crawl. His smile never quite reached his eyes. The cabin appeared suddenly around a sharp bend, a looming shadow against the darkening sky that seemed to swallow what little daylight remained. Its windows glowed with warm light, but something about the structure seemed fundamentally wrong. Too many locks on the door, bars on the windows that seemed designed to keep things in rather than out, and a metal chimney that rose like a twisted spine against the twilight sky. The surrounding clearing was unnaturally bare, with no undergrowth or small animals visible, as if nature itself shunned the place. Inside, James immediately noticed the walls. They were covered floor to ceiling with missing persons posters, dozens of them, all featuring hikers who had vanished along the Appalachian Trail over the past several years. Some were sun-faded and wrinkled with age, while others looked fresh enough to have been printed yesterday. Each face stared out with that same haunting expression, the casual smile of someone who had no idea they were being photographed for the last time. Larry watched James's reaction with unsettling intensity, his eyes reflecting the warm light from the fireplace in a way that made them appear almost predatory. He explained that he collected the posters as part of his research into trail safety, claiming to work with local authorities to understand disappearance patterns. He moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency, methodically checking and securing each lock, drawing heavy curtains that looked thick enough to muffle sound. The furniture was sparse but sturdy, with chairs bolted to the floor and tables made of solid oak that could easily support a man's weight. When James asked about the conspicuous empty space on one wall, Larry smiled that same cold smile and said it was reserved for his next trophy. That's when James noticed the dates on the posters. Each disappearance had occurred during a full moon. His eyes darted to the window, where the clouds were beginning to part, revealing the telltale glow of tonight's lunar cycle. Over a bowl of rich stew that filled the cabin with an unfamiliar but appetizing aroma, Larry shared stories of his life in the mountains. He spoke of his grandfather teaching him to track during the Great Depression, when hunting wasn't sport, but survival. His words painted a picture of a man shaped by necessity into something harder than modern society could understand. Each tale seemed to peel back layers of civilization, revealing glimpses of older, darker ways of living. The cabin's walls drew closer as evening deepened, the faces on the missing persons posters watching their dinner conversation like silent witnesses. James found himself studying Larry's collection of vintage hunting photographs dating back decades, weathered images showing different men but somehow the same cold smile, the same proud stance over their quarry. Some photos were recent enough to be in color, while others had yellowed with age, creating a disturbing timeline of what Larry called his family tradition. The conversation shifted to modern hunting regulations, triggering something raw in Larry's usually controlled demeanor. He railed against arbitrary seasons and restrictions, arguing that true hunting was about understanding prey on a fundamental level, learning its patterns, habits, fears. The best prey, he said, measuring each word carefully, is the kind that thinks it's the predator. He described tracking bear hunters to study their techniques, his tones suggesting both admiration and contempt for their methods. James noticed how Larry categorized all living things into predator or prey, with humans straddling an ambiguous line between the two. He spoke of watching hikers from hidden blinds, analyzing their behavior with detached fascination. People follow such predictable patterns, he observed, refilling James's bowl without asking. They stick to marked trails, cluster in groups, carry electronic safety nets, but remove those artificial advantages. He let the thought hang unfinished, his attention fixed on James's reaction. The stew's warmth turned to ice in James's stomach as Larry began discussing specific disappearances, referencing details that hadn't appeared in news reports. He described the victims' final choices with unsettling precision, critiquing their survival instincts like a professor grading papers. The educated ones last longer, he noted, but they overthink. The best chances come from embracing something older than thought. His eyes reflected firelight in a way that made James acutely aware of the growing distance between himself and the door, and of how the poster's dates aligned with lunar cycles that Larry had yet to mention. The first signs of the rising full moon filtered through the curtains, painting silver stripes across the cabin floor that seemed to pulse with otherworldly energy. Larry's demeanor shifted subtly but unmistakably, like a mask slipping to reveal something inhuman beneath. His movements became more predatory, each gesture carefully controlled yet somehow wrong, as if his body was struggling to maintain a shape that didn't quite fit. His smile showed too many teeth, and his eyes reflected the moonlight like polished coins. When James made an excuse about needing fresh air, trying to keep the panic from his voice, Larry smoothly blocked his path to the door. The temperature in the cabin seemed to drop several degrees as Larry spoke, his voice carrying a new undertone that raised the hair on James's neck. "The hunt's already begun," he said softly, almost tenderly. "It started the moment you got in my truck. They all make the same choices, take the same risks. It's like they want to be caught." The room's details suddenly stood out in sharp relief, each one adding to the mounting horror. James noticed deep scratch marks on the floorboards, some partially concealed by strategic placement of furniture. Dark stains that might have been blood had soaked into the wood in patterns that suggested desperate struggles. A collection of personal effects that could have belonged to the missing hikers was arranged with museum-like precision on crude shelves. Watches, jewelry, wallets, all tagged with dates that corresponded to the posters above them. A backpack in the corner caught James's attention, looking eerily similar to one pictured in the most recent missing person poster. The date on that poster was exactly 1 lunar cycle ago, and James could see small tears in the fabric that looked disturbingly like claw marks. Larry followed his gaze and smiled, running his tongue over his teeth in a gesture that seemed more threat than habit. The attack came without warning, Larry moving with shocking speed for his size, but James's heightened adrenaline gave him just enough warning to dodge the first lunge. The ensuing struggle sent them crashing through the cabin, knocking over furniture and tearing down some of the posters. James caught glimpses of the faces as they fluttered to the ground. Men and women who had come this way before, who had probably fought for their lives in this very room, whose final moments were about to be reflected in his own desperate battle. Using a broken chair as a weapon, James managed to create enough space between them to bolt for the door. But Larry seemed to have anticipated this. He triggered some hidden mechanism that plunged the cabin into total darkness, the sudden absence of light so complete it felt like a physical pressure against James's eyes. The only illumination came from the full moon outside, its cold light streaming through gaps in the curtains to cast long shadows that made every corner seem alive with threat. James could hear Larry moving in the darkness with impossible surety, his footsteps too quiet for his size, his breathing taking on an animal quality that suggested the man's facade was finally dropping completely. Larry's voice took on an almost gleeful tone as he explained the rules of his hunt, describing how long his victims typically lasted, how far they usually ran before exhaustion took them. The worst part was his absolute certainty. He spoke like someone who had performed this ritual countless times, who knew exactly how every attempt to escape would end. The hunt unfolded across the moonlit forest like a primordial dance, one that had played out countless times before with different partners. James crashed through the underbrush, his city-bred trail experience nothing compared to Larry's intimate knowledge of these woods. Every direction looked the same in the silvery light, the trees morphing into cage-like shadows that seemed to redirect him back toward the cabin. The sounds of pursuit came from everywhere and nowhere, branches snapping, leaves rustling, and something that might have been laughter or might have been growling. Larry called out to him periodically, his voice changing, becoming less human with each taunt. He described in vivid detail how the others had died, how they'd begged, how their fear had seasoned the meat. The worst part was how he mixed their names and personal details into his calls, proving that the posters weren't just for show. He had hunted each one, learned their stories, preserved their memories in his twisted trophy collection. James's salvation came in the form of his past research on predator behaviors for a wildlife photography project. He recognized the pattern in Larry's pursuit, the way he was being herded toward what was likely a prepared killing ground. Instead of running straight, James began moving in spirals, using the moonlight to maintain his orientation. He doubled back several times, leaving false trails and using streams to mask his scent, though some primitive part of his brain screamed at him that normal tracking methods wouldn't work against whatever Larry had become. The chase ended where it began, but not as Larry had planned. James had worked his way back to the cabin, knowing his only chance lay in using the hunter's own territory against him. He found the fuse box outside and killed the power, then slipped inside through a window he'd secretly unlocked earlier. In the darkness, he rearranged furniture to mirror the cabin's layout in Larry's preferred killing room, creating a fatal maze for anyone operating on muscle memory. When Larry finally burst in, convinced he had cornered his prey, James was ready. The ensuing struggle destroyed most of the trophy wall, sending years of collected memories fluttering through the air like macabre confetti. The hunter's overconfidence proved to be his undoing. He was so used to playing with his food that he never expected it to bite back. James ended the fight with Larry's own hunting knife, the one he had boasted about using to process his trophies. In the aftermath, as James caught his breath and the adrenaline slowly faded, he found himself staring at the empty space on the wall, the one Larry had reserved for his next trophy. With trembling hands, he took down the other posters and replaced them with a single new one. The photo showed Larry in his hunting gear, smiling that predatory smile. The date listed was tonight's, and under last seen, he wrote simply, his cabin during a full moon. They found other cabins in the following weeks, each with its own collection of trophies. The official story blamed a deranged serial killer, and in a way, that was true enough. But on full moon nights, when the silver light paints the mountains in shades of bone and shadow, James sometimes thinks he hears hunting calls in the distance, and he wonders if perhaps Larry wasn't working alone. Subscribe for more chilling tales from the Nightmare Maestro.